Hey guys, this is Paul like Internet for Poker Market's hand of the day. Today we have a red hand, so it's going to be in for some fun today. And this hand was posted on the 2+2 medium stakes no limit cash game forum. It is a no limit 1000 hand. 4 people dealt into the hand. Stat wise, they all look pretty reasonable. And Hero picks up a suited ace-3 on the button and decides to use 2.5 big blind open raise into the unopened pot. Faces a small blind 3-bet to 9 big blinds and decides to use this for a 22 big blind 4-bet in the situation. Don't want to talk about that, just seems reasonably standard. And the flop comes with 10-6-3, a flush draw between the 6 and 3, and a backdoor flush on the 10 for us. And the small blind checks, and I want to talk about this situation, this decision point for Hero, in terms of what should you do with this hand, but also what sizing plan is reasonable here. So I think there's generally 2 different sizing plans we can discuss here. The first one is Hero decides to bet the flop for around 20 to 25 big blinds, as he did, and then decides to put the rest of the money in with another bet, potentially on the turn, or keeping about 50 to 60 big blinds behind in stacks. And the other bet sizing plan is the 3-street sizing plan, which would be the flop is bet for a much smaller amount, something like 10 to 15 big blinds. Then the plan is to bet on the turn, usually if there's a bet around the size of the flop bet right here, and then again the last of the money goes in after that. So what are the merits for choosing one of these 2 sizing plans on this particular flop in this particular situation, and what are the merits for this particular hand? Now, this is generally very difficult to figure out what sizing plan you should choose for your hands and which one is going to work best. But the way I would usually tackle this is we think about the hands we most likely have and what actions they prefer to take. So one likely hand we're going to have here as Hero, which likes to bet the flop, is going to be, of course, our strong value 4-bets pre-flop. So those are the aces, kings, queens, maybe jacks, maybe 10s. And what sizing plan do they prefer? Do they prefer to bet the flop a little bit bigger and push on the turn, or do they prefer to bet the flop a little bit smaller and split the money over multiple streets? So splitting the money into multiple streets is maximum value against bluff catchers, but splitting into multiple streets does give the opponent the option to make profitable drawing calls. So we sort of have to balance those two things, and have to think how often does the opponent have a very weak bluff catcher versus how often does the opponent have a legitimate drawing hand that benefits from us betting smaller. And on this board, that very much depends on how the small blind's preflop range is structured for 3-betting and calling a 4-bet. Now let's think about a specific hand. If the small blind has something like a king-queen, and we have something like a jacks plus or 10s plus value range, we much prefer to bet the flop really, really small, because the small blind cannot take advantage of us, of drawing against us even when we use a small size. Same thing if small blind has an ace-jack or an ace-queen. Against our value range, he has very few outs, and even if we give him a good price, he can't really use that too well. But we do get maximum value against those bluff-catching, ace-highs, or maybe king-queen is not quite bluff-catching, but against those types of weaker made hands. Now, the hands which do benefit from the smaller size in the small blind's position are those hands which turn or which flop a lot of equity against aces, kings, queens, jacks, which are the gut shots or the flop pairs, or better draws like that. Maybe a queen jack of diamonds might profitably call a very small flop bet and then continue profitably against a small turn bet on a lot of turns, but would against this larger flop bet just have to sacrifice EV. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer here, and when I can't answer a question, I usually look for somewhere else for an answer. In this case, I ran a solver on the situation, which is very dependent, of course, on the preflop ranges. So we're quickly going to look at the ones I picked here. So I put the Hero on a range which looks like this. You can pause and look at it in detail, but I put a lot of weight on the queens plus ace king, and then a little bit of weight on the jacks, ace queen, and good bluff hands, and a little bit of weight on other hands. And then I put the small blinds out of position 3-bet call 4-bet range, something like this, a lot of weight on ace queen and suited high cards and 10s and 9s, and a little bit of weight on some other hands. And if we run this solve for a allowed half pot as c-bet for the button, which is what the player did here, then we'll get a solution which we'll look at in a second. Now then, I want to, before we look at it, I forgot to talk about what we do with ace-3 specifically. So ace-3, what does this like to do on the flop? So it certainly likes to bet against the hands such as queen-jack or king-queen to make them fold their equity, or of course to value bet. Against hands like ace queen ace jack, it's not so clear what it prefers to do. Of course, it might have a value bet, but of course it might also be a very nice check behind against those to catch some bluffs or ideally hit an ace. And so I think for all those purposes, ace-3 certainly prefers a much smaller sizing than the half-pot bet. So I don't like this one for half-pot c-bet sizing plan here at all. I think it's more of a check or bet small hand. But we'll see what the solver says, and I've been surprised many times. We're going to look at, I fixed the small blind for being only able to check on the flop, which is a big simplification. There may be some donking going on here. I do think we can be, we can locally assume that there is 100% checks, and after that the small blind plays really well, so I don't think this is a huge problem. But of course, there's some problem in the assumption that he plays extremely well after always checking, but the always checking is not correct. Like, that's always a bit tricky, but we'll just assume that. And then we see as the button will have a c-bet frequency of only around 30%, which seems very low to me. But we're going to look at that range, and we can see the button actually prefers to check aces, kings, ace, king very frequently on this texture, and only really goes for value with the more vulnerable queens, jacks, ace 10 hands, which is I find a little bit interesting. And we can look specifically at ace-3. All of them are actually, including ace-3 diamonds, strictly preferring to check back on the flop over betting half pot. This is almost a big blind difference, so that's a pretty significant difference. Yeah, that's what the solver would like to do here. Now, I also ran a solve on a smaller flop size option, and this is all on screen. It looks good. Again, small one can only check. The pre-flop ranges are identical, and I gave the button now a second bet sizing option, which is the 1/4 bet, 110 type flop bet, which was the other sizing plan I referenced. And we can see the solver does prefer to use the smaller sizing a little bit, and instead of betting around 30%, he's now betting around 45% of the time in total. And we can again look if ace-3 likes to use the size, and what we'll find is actually that the ace-3 in diamonds still strictly prefers checking over using the small size, but it's much closer than before. And the other ace-3 non-vector flush draw ace-3s, they are actually indifferent between using a check back option or a tiny flop bet option. So I think that's very interesting, and I think this matches with my intuition, but sometimes these things certainly do not match. Now another thing I want to look at is the turn, how the hand continued. Technically we talked about something interesting, but it did turn out very interesting after that. So the turn card brought the flush draw for hero, so a little bit good development aside from improving to 2-pair trips. And small one decides to check on the turn. We have our 55-60 big blinds left, and hero decides to push here, and that's of course a little bit also discussion in this thread. Is that correct or not? And for this one, we're just going to look at what the solver would do, and we'll go back to the other solution with the half pot sizing only allowed, because that's the line hero chose here. And we'll go into opponent calls. Now we actually have to give him, because ace-3 was never checked here, we can't look at a turn solution without that. So I'll just put this into bet here, and then go into the turn calls. The turn card is already put in. Calc turns for these new ranges. And something very interesting actually happens is that the small blind prefers to donk bet push the turn quite frequently, around 30% of the time, and I guess this option is effectively a push. So there's some weird settings here. So now there's only pushing allowed on the turn, which makes much more sense. No, there's also a half pot. Well, that's not played, so it doesn't matter. So small blind actually donk jams the turn around half the time, which is very interesting. I think it's a play you should certainly learn how to use properly. But if the small blind does not donk shove, then the button does shove about half the time. And we can look at those, what the shoving range there looks like. Of course, it's going to be most of the value hands just going to push when there's more draws connecting. And if we look at ace-3, we can see that the ace-3 of hearts, ace-3 of clubs are indifferent between pushing and checking behind the turn, whereas the ace-3 with the turn flush draw is strongly preferring to check the turn back over pushing. And you can think about why that is, but I think this is a very interesting result, which definitely shows that this hand was probably misplayed with the flop bet and probably misplayed with the turn bet, assuming, of course, the small blind is a reasonable player that plays somewhere close to what a good small blind play looks like, which certainly is some assumption to make. But yeah, so yeah. Hope you liked this little discussion of the flop sizing plan and looking at this hand in the solver results. This was Paul, aka Internet for Poker Markets, hand of the day. Take care, guys.